Hi, very good morning to all of you. I have been meaning to shoot this video for a reasonably long length of time, and there is a whole host of confusion and doubt about the Greek society being a society that celebrated homoeroticism and we had plethora of abundance of all sorts of sexual celebrations in Greek society. No, it was not. And the corpophobia that came into being with the inception of what should I call Christianity, Catholic Christianity, and the things worsened during the Victorian age, and think did turn out as it did in the 1950s America. Now I would be breaking this YouTube shoot into four parts. The first part would deal with how Greeks were as much patriarchal, if not more patriarchal than we are. And the second part would deal with what happened with the arrival of Christianity and during its aftermath. And the fourth part would deal with the Victorian age, and the third part would deal with the Victorian age, and the fourth part would obviously deal with late capitalism, pop culture, and 1950s USA. So let's go back to Athens in those happy old classical times. Now, the Greeks, they strongly believed that women and slaves were similar. Yes, right? Women and slaves were similar, and there were no differences. There was no hierarchy between women and slaves. So men would be up there with the very best, and women and slaves would be toddling, would be saddled together with the animals. Now, why did they think so? Now, before I explain the reason of the rubric of their thought, let me go back to this perception of women and slaves being straddled together, and men would be hierarchically privileged. Now, men should live with men with intellectual harmony, because if men rub shoulder with women, that is their inferior gendered ontologies, what would happen? They would lose their intellectual sheen, and they would no longer remain half as good a creature that they could otherwise be. So that's why men should be careful in not mixing too much with women. Men should be careful in not having too much sex with women, because women were thought to be cold. Now, although we think women to be hot these days, but women were thought to be cold back in those times. And why they were thought cold? Because and men on the other hand were thought hot. So if men could have too much sex with women and vis-a-vis, then men could lose their this. So there was a society that was built around a love and intellectual understanding within the symposium of men and men. So that got us to think, was that society homoerotic? I would have to break your heart, and I would say no, its society was not homoerotic. Then what was it? It was the hierarchical hatred against animals and women and slaves that got men to live together. So it was, unfortunately, I'm sorry, I cannot make you happy by calling that ancient classical society was queer. No, ancient classical Greek society was definitely not queer. Now, if we jump when Roman Catholic Christianity made its way, then something called, for the want of a better word, something called corpophobia got introduced. Corpophobia, what is corpophobia? Corpophobia means fear of the body. Phobia is the fear. Corpo means body. So corpophobia basically means it's a fear of the body. So Christianity, the inception of Christianity, what did it do? It taught us to be afraid of our own body, of our own body, of our own body. We should be scared of our own body. Body is something that we cannot talk about. Body is something that we have to be wary of. Body is something that we need to be far more careful of. Now, why are we doing this? Why did Christianity do this? Because they had to stabilize the body, upon which they could stabilize the gender and they could stabilize the desire and sexuality as well. Now, if we have to understand this, then we have to jump again from the Renaissance, 16th century Europe to, say, 19th century West Europe. I am talking about Victorian age, yes. Now, that age is extraordinary in so many several ways. Why? Because the Victorian age created all these taxonomies. And what are these taxonomies? These taxonomies like homosexual, like heterosexual, like transsexual, like bisexual, and all those things. As if some of these taxonomies are diseases, and some of these taxonomies are cures. For example, homosexuality was invented earlier than heterosexuality. Now, why was it earlier invented than heterosexuality? Because unless you diagnose the disease, you cannot determine the patient. And unless you cannot determine the patient, you cannot address the recovery. And unless you cannot address the recovery, you cannot stabilize the metaphysics of human foundation. So this is exactly something that Victorian society was spuriously doing. So they kind of identified and categorized and underlined all those diseases like homosexuality, like bisexuality. These are the diseases that were invented by the Victorian science. And when I say science, I do mean Foucaultian scientia sexualis. To identify the diseases means you can now recover the patient. And who is the patient? The patient are those people who are not practicing any version of sexuality other than heterosexuality, and thereby heteronormativity, and thereby heteropatriarchy. Because you know how much heterosexuality was being normalized and clubbed and collapsed into patriarchy. Now, when heterosexuality was being clubbed with patriarchy and heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity or normalization of heterosexuality, it was necessarily being done through the identification of and a categorization and underlining of those diseases, so that we can identify the rugi. And once we can identify the patient, we can identify how we can cure the patient from that disease that he or she must be suffering from. But it all happened during the second half of the 19th century, right? That is throughout the Victorian age, as it were. Now, we have to jump half century to conclude this video shoot. Let's jump into 1950s America. What was happening in 1950s America? 1950s America was a terrible decade for feminism. And why do I think it was a terrible decade of feminism? Because 1950s saw the discovery of these washing machines, these refrigerators, and those micro ovens and all those things, and women were being shoved off away from those workplaces inside those houses. And ironically, it coincided with the publication of the Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, I think probably in the 1949. So yes, it was not the brightest of decades for the movements of feminist criticism, but things started to look up, although very differently for feminists, from 1970s onwards, because Stonewall riots took place and the LGBTQ community, they rioted against the New York police, against the Stonewall movements and all those things. And London School of Economics found a tremendous amount of support from the Stonewall riot in New York City. So the rise of gay, lesbian, transgender, queer movements created a different configuration of masculinity, and that configuration of masculinity went from being the subject in the Greek society to being the subject object in the middle of the Renaissance, and onto the object to being the 1950s and 1970s America, particularly in the aftermath of LGBTQ plus intersection movements. Now, this disempowerment or softening of masculinity definitely contributed to a kind of handling of patriarchy that patriarchy was not prepared for. But as I say, patriarchy is very much like COVID-19, patriarchy is very much like coronavirus. No drug, no vaccine is good enough till we got ourselves a wonderful vaccine called queer studies. Now, why do I think it's a wonderful vaccine? Because with the inception of queer studies, we benefited ourselves in a couple of ways. Not only feminists recovered from this wretched 1950s decade with the queer. So feminists got a very good theoretical and critical friends in queer. But also patriarchy now does not know how to fight queer. Who are they? It used to be a slang, and how could they be now subversive, critically, intellectually and theoretically? So therefore, feminism found a new chapter in queer studies in 1970s, 1980s onwards. And we will talk about this wonderful growing development of friendship between feminist studies and queer studies in subsequent videos. But with this thought, I thank all of you for watching my video. Stay home, stay safe, and see you very, very soon. Thank you.